Hi everybody, my name is Dr. John Paul Garrison. I'm a clinical and forensic psychologist practicing in Atlanta, Georgia, and today we are going to be exploring hidden meanings in nonverbal behaviors. What we're going to do is we're going to look at nonverbal behaviors related to deceit, nonverbal behaviors related to safety or aggression, and just ways to enhance your overall observational skills. We're going to be doing this by using the ARC analysis system, which I created. The ARC analysis system, ARC, A-R-C, stands for action, reason, concern. And what that means is that the action is the nonverbal behavior you see, the reason is the reason that person is engaging in that behavior, and the concern is any concerns you might have based on what you've seen. It'll make a lot more sense once we get into it, so bear with me for just a minute. So emotions are handled by the limbic system in the brain, and while it's not essential that you remember limbic and the terminology, what I want you to understand is there's a part of the brain that handles emotions and that there are involuntary behaviors that come when that system's activated. So, for example, when you feel nervous, you sweat. When you feel anxious, sometimes you might scratch your face or something like that. Those behaviors come from the limbic system. The purpose of the limbic system is to increase our ability to survive. Okay, so the idea that when the limbic system is activated, we have these certain behaviors. In some way, we believe that that is going to help us survive a situation on some level. Okay, so when we go back to 10,000 years ago, when the world was a very different place, when there was a lot more things you had to survive, there's certain things that our bodies learn to do involuntarily to help that. One of the best theories behind deceptive behaviors comes from a former FBI special agent named Joe Navarro. It is based on the idea that when we're comfortable, we don't show deceptive behaviors, but when we're uncomfortable, we have to do things to make ourselves feel calm. So in other words, when our body is at rest and our limbic system isn't activated, when we're being truthful, we have no reason to make ourselves feel more comfortable. Okay, so if we're in a conversation and you're telling the truth, there's no reason to do things to pacify yourself. And what that means in terms of the pacifying behaviors is that when you feel uncomfortable, you do certain things to calm yourself down. So for example, for males in particular, when we get very stressed out or when we're getting really bothered by something, we start to touch our necks like this. And what that does is that calms us down. There's a lot of nerves in the neck and that makes you feel calmer. So what we're going to be looking for when we talk about deception and lying in behavior is we're going to look for changes in behavior. So in other words, if somebody is talking to you and the entire time they're doing this or they're touching their face, they're doing stuff, maybe that's just some sort of idiosyncratic behavior they have. Maybe that's just something they do. That doesn't really tell you a whole lot about behaviors, but if they're pretty calm and then you start talking about something and they start doing this or they start doing this, then you go, okay, maybe there's something to what I'm talking about that's making this person feel uncomfortable. Is it because they're lying or being deceptive? That's one idea. Maybe it's something else, but those behaviors are done to calm people down. The last theoretical thing I'm going to talk about is one of the reasons that we're able to look at deceitful behavior, and the reason that we're able to spot it is because of the leakage hypothesis, which in other words means that we have emotional leakage. When we're trying to hide something, the emotions will leak out in our actions, our behaviors, or the way that we act. So somehow we're going to express how we're feeling. It's just a matter of knowing how to see that. This is extremely important. There are no behaviors that absolutely indicate lying or deceit, period. I don't care what anybody says, there's nothing that is 100% that means that person is lying. So when we go through some of these, I don't want you to use these and look at people and go, oh, that person's definitely lying, or this person's doing that or that. What this is going to do is it's going to help you understand the fundamentals behind why we engage in certain types of behaviors. It'll help you understand to look and observe better, but it doesn't mean, okay, so somebody's scratching their face, that means they're lying to me. That's not at all what this means. And anybody that tells you otherwise themselves is probably lying or is just misinformed. So let's go on to look at some examples and go through how to better understand reading deceit and lying in nonverbal behaviors. So I initially developed ARC analysis to be used by law enforcement. The way that I'm going to be talking about it today is specifically going to be focusing on lying, deceit, and safety, but it doesn't have to be. I'm going to be doing another series of videos later that's going to be focusing on more business interaction and things like that. So if those aren't on YouTube yet, come back and those will be up at some point. To reiterate what ARC analysis means, the A in ARC is an action, so in other words, the nonverbal behavior that you observe. The R is reason, so the reason that person is unconsciously engaging in that behavior. And the C is concern. So in other words, what concern should you have based on what you're seeing? Is there no concern? Is there a concern for your safety? Is there a minimal amount of concern? What type of concern do you have based on what you're seeing? There are 4 levels of concern with ARC analysis. One being minimal concern, which means exactly what it sounds like, which is that there's not much concern related to a certain behavior. The second behavior would be what we call an examine prompt. So in other words, there's something that is worth examining more. So you start seeing a behavior that you think, that's interesting, maybe I need to look a little bit more into that. Then there's the suspicion prompt where somebody's showing some pretty strong signs of lying or deceit, and they're starting to act rather suspicious, so you really need to push more. And then there's the safety prompt, which means this person's engaging in behaviors that can very literally impair my safety. So now that we've gone through the fundamentals of why we engage in certain nonverbal behaviors, let's look at specific examples. We're going to start with the torso. So let's go through a scenario. Let's say that you ask somebody, what were you doing last night? And they said, I don't remember. It was late. I don't know. I'm not sure what I was doing. I don't remember. Or you ask somebody the same question, what were you doing last night? And they go, I'm not really sure. I don't remember what I did last night. Okay, so there's a lot there. I don't know what your initial impression is. I want you to figure out which one of those is suggesting lying or deceitful behavior. If you saw the first action as being the one that was more likely to be truthful, then you're correct. So now let's explain why that is. What's the difference between the first one and the second one? How can we tell the difference? Well, the first one, what I did is I had my arms wide open. And what that does is that leaves my torso totally vulnerable. Okay, so if we're going back in evolutionary terms, your head and your body need to be protected. This is where all the important stuff is. Your hands are important, but not so important. If a bear attacks you and it tears your hand off, you're going to live. If a bear attacks you and it takes your head, not so much. So we try to protect this stuff. All right, so when I leave my arms wide open, I'm leaving myself open, and that's more likely that I am being open and honest. I'm being expressive, I'm being open, I'm being honest. I'm moving around, I'm allowing myself to be seen. Okay, and now the second example, I pull up one shoulder. It's kind of non-committal. I'm not really sure that I want to open myself up that much. I'm moving less. The less you move, the more you feel like maybe I can stay hidden. Maybe if I stay hidden, I won't be noticed. And I was also shaking my head yes when I said that I didn't remember. There's all of these very subtle things that you can observe when people are engaging in behaviors that are in some way trying to be deceptive. So, as a general principle, the more open you are, the more open your body is, the more likely you are to be telling the truth. The more closed your body is, the more likely you are not to necessarily be lying, but the more likely you're trying to protect yourself in some way. No single behavior in isolation means a whole lot. It's when you got to look at the big picture. So, understanding this system and understanding everything, it takes a lot of work on your end. So now let's talk about some things you can observe from watching somebody's torso and shoulders. Our torso houses many vital organs, and so oftentimes comforting behaviors that you're going to observe are going to be about blocking your torso or protecting it in some way. The next action we're going to talk about is body shielding, or crossing your arms like this. The reason that people do that unconsciously is to calm themselves or to make themselves feel comfortable. So it could just be a normal comforting behavior, but if you see people do this with clenched fists, that might mean something else. They might be a lot more tense, they might be more anxious or nervous or something like that. The action of a torso splay, or in other words, taking up as much room as you can with your torso, it is typically done as a sign of disrespect. So the reason people do that is to be disrespectful. It is to show that it's their territory. And the concern that comes with that, it could be a safety concern. In particular, if we're talking about law enforcement, when people start doing that, it could indicate that they are aggressive or that they're hostile. Now, if you observe the action of somebody baring the torso, or in other words, taking off their shirt, then the reason they're doing that typically is to get ready for a fight. Now, I know that may sound obvious, but if we're talking about on an unconscious level, that really is why somebody would bare their torso, because it would be preparing to fight. So that once again would be a safety concern. If you get a two-shoulder shrug, the reason people typically do that is genuinely because they don't know. That generally means, I don't know. And so there's a minimal concern. If the action you observe is a one-shoulder shrug, sometimes that means that they're trying to be deceptive or that they're trying to deflect in some fashion. So that could be a suspicion concern. That could be something that is a highly suspicious behavior under the right circumstances. Arms are very versatile, and I think that for a lot of people they are underutilized when it comes to observing nonverbal behaviors. Arms can be used to defend ourselves or to show aspects of ourselves, like wearing a watch or having tattoos. It can try to help us express who we are. Hands are extremely complex and are extremely useful for people when communicating. People who are open and honest tend to talk a lot with their hands, and people who are liars tend to not talk as much with their hands. It's a very basic rule, and it's not 100%, but generally that's something that we've observed. So if you see a significant amount of arm movement, if that's the action you're observing, then the reason people oftentimes are doing that is that they're being open. Usually when people have significant arm movement, they're leaving themselves open. And so the reason they would do that is that they're probably being genuine or being open to you. So, that doesn't mean everything they're saying is true, but it means that they're trying to be open. If you're to see the action of restricted arm movement, or when somebody's walking and they're not moving their arms, or something like that, oftentimes they're trying to appear invisible. So the reason people do that is that they do not want to be noticed. So whether that's because they're trying to stay safe, or whether that's because they've engaged in something they shouldn't have and they don't want you to see them, the less somebody moves their arms, the more likely they are trying to hide something. So if you observe the action of somebody putting their arms behind their back, now they are trying to hide their hands, but they're also leaving their chest open, which would be unusual in terms of like a suspect as far as law enforcement goes. If they were, I'm not talking about when they were handcuffed, but if they were just standing with their hands behind their back, yeah, they may have something to hide, but it would be not necessarily something you're going to see a whole lot because that leaves them very open. Now, people putting their hands on their hips like this, which is something that people in law enforcement often do, can often be a sign of dominance. In a job like law enforcement, you need to be able to show dominance, and so it's not uncommon that you'll see a police officer, for example, with his hands on his hips. Now, if the role is reversed and a police officer is approaching somebody and that person stands there with their legs open and their hands on their hips, that could be a concern for safety because that could mean that this person is hostile or aggressive because they're trying to show dominance over somebody else. Now, if you're sitting and your hands go between your knees, that can be a loss of confidence. So if you're in a meeting with somebody, for example, and you're negotiating with somebody and you feel like it's going really well, then things go south really quickly, your hands might go right between your legs because you are now feeling not as confident as you once were. In the context of law enforcement, this would be something worth examining. In the context of just general interaction, it still means the same thing, but it would elicit a different level of what should be paid attention to. Now, if you have arms crossed with hands on the biceps, if you're sitting there and gripping your arms, usually that means defensiveness. I mean, if you think about how much tension it takes to do something like this is not a comfortable way to sit. It's almost like you're gripping, holding on, getting ready for something. I mean, that's why you grip like that. So if you see somebody standing that way, they're probably pretty uncomfortable. It's not so much a typical pacifying behaviors like some of the other ones we've talked about, but it's like somebody bracing themselves, getting ready for impact or getting ready for something bad. So this could oftentimes mean that somebody is engaging in being defensive. So there would be a reason to examine that more in order to see it as suspicious if somebody's doing it excessively. Next, we're going to talk about hands. So open hands away from the body, oftentimes that can mean sincerity. Oftentimes people can see that as sincerity, and it makes sense. We're leaving ourselves very open. So as far as concerns go, there's minimal concern with that. Now, for people with withdrawn hands, you put them in your pocket, you put them behind your back, you put them somewhere. I mean, oftentimes it can be people associated with deceptiveness, but it could just be discomfort. It could just be that people feel insecure and they just don't know what to do with their hands. So don't read too much into people hiding their hands. Finger pointing is a big one. I hate to do this to people, and I always make sure that I don't do this when I'm talking to people. I'm doing it right now because I'm trying to demonstrate it. But if somebody points at you, we are wired to dislike that. Even at a very young age, if your mother points at you, you know automatically, like, that's not good. Even if it doesn't mean anything in the context of your family necessarily, like, we are wired to know that somebody pointing their finger at you is not a good thing. It is a hostile act. when I work with couples, I oftentimes see couples pointing at each other, and that's when I can tell things are starting to get disrespectful, when people are really starting to get angry. And if it's law enforcement and somebody starts pointing their finger at law enforcement, or they start, trying to poke at a police officer or something like that, that is extreme hostility. That is definitely something that could indicate a concern for safety or a concern for the type of behavior they're engaging in. Now, sweaty hands, that's another one that we see a lot, and it's so common, it's hard to read too much into it. Other than, nervousness causes people's hands to sweat. There's a million reasons people's hands sweat. If somebody has sweaty hands, don't think, if you've just gotten done talking to somebody and they shake your hand, don't think that means they were lying to you. That might just mean they were nervous, So don't read too much into hand sweating. Maybe it means something, maybe it doesn't. There's too many possible meanings. It's not worth paying attention to too much. Now, shaky hands. Now, some people are more sensitive with having shaky hands than others. Some people do tend to shake a little bit more. But in general, shaky hands means that you've got adrenaline going. And not just like feeling a little nervous. It means that's a lot of adrenaline, like if your hands are actually shaking. So what that would usually indicate is an elevated heart rate. So if you're talking to somebody, or if you're talking to somebody who's suspicious and they start literally shaking, that probably means they're feeling quite nervous. That doesn't necessarily mean they're lying, but it means that whatever you're talking about at that time is probably worth exploring more. Now, this is something, it's called steepling. You see the fingers put together like this. I'm sure everybody's seen executives do this on TV. Donald Trump can be observed doing this quite a lot. There's a lot of people that we see who tend to do this behavior. And if it's high up and it's like this, that's an extreme sign of confidence. The research has shown that people that do this are actually observed to be more believable when they're talking about something. So you see this a lot with executives and things like that. Now, on the law enforcement side of things, if you were to be talking to someone who's a suspect and they start doing this, that could be a sign of arrogance or overconfidence, or trying to express that they know more than you, or trying to belittle somebody else. So while it can be effective in certain situations, there are also situations where if you start doing this, people are going to feel disrespected. So if people don't use many hand gestures, or they don't move their hands around much, typically that's associated with people observing that person to be less honest. Whether or not that's always the case, I'm not sure, but it's perceived that way, and unconsciously. So if we see somebody, or we know somebody that talks and they just don't ever move their hands, we tend to think of that person as being less honest. And if we're in a situation where lying or deceit is relevant or important, then it's going to be likely that if we see them try to not move their hands at all, that's going to be associated with dishonesty. The face often shows signs of stress and is our primary method of communication. So it's our most prone to be really good at lying. So the face is one that can be hard to interpret because we've got a whole lifetime of practice thinking that this is how we should lie. If we're going to make something up, or if we're going to hide something, this is how we should do it. Okay? So the face can be hard to interpret, but when people touch their neck, when people touch their face, that often is very much a sign to try to pacify ourselves or to calm ourselves down. So gaze aversion, so looking away or not wanting to look at somebody, is oftentimes thought of as being related to lying or deceit. But it's often way overused in that regard. Frankly, I don't even pay attention to that when I'm trying to figure out information related to lying and deceit. So there's too many reasons people can look away. They can be uncomfortable, they can just be shy. I mean, there's a million reasons people can look away or not want to look you in the eye. So, honestly, I would write that off and not pay too much attention to that. Now, squinting eyes is an interesting one. And this is something that when I'm in therapy with a client, or when I'm doing an evaluation on somebody, I notice quite often. So when people squint their eyes, if you say something they don't like, or, for example, and this is an extreme example, I wouldn't say this to somebody, but if you said to somebody, I really don't like that shirt a whole lot. Somebody starts doing this, just starts squinting their eyes. You said something that they don't like. They're trying to block their mind from sort of getting that. So that's why they squint their eyes. It's called eye shielding. And so sometimes people just literally will close their eyes if they're talking about something really intense. But when you watch somebody squint, if you're saying something, that might mean you said something that bothered them. Or that might mean that you're saying something that is making them feel irritated or something like that. So eye squinting, if you pay very close attention to it, can be very important. If you see somebody blinking excessively, oftentimes that's associated with stress or anxiety. So it might be worth examining that behavior more. Now, flaring nostrils is an interesting one. So you probably can't see my nostrils flaring right here, but when you flare your nostrils, that means when the wing of the nostril is open. That means you're taking in more oxygen. And why that's important is that if we are oxygenated, we are ready to fight. Okay, when we are oxygenating ourselves, when we are flaring our nostrils, that means we are preparing for action. That doesn't necessarily mean, like if law enforcement saw somebody doing that, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to get attacked, but that means that person is, if not mentally preparing for action, which could just mean they're thinking about doing something, they're physically preparing to either run or fight or something. But that oftentimes can be an important clue to avoiding hostile confrontation. So, if somebody's about to have an explosion of energy, they're going to be taking in more oxygen. So if somebody starts flaring their nostrils, as odd as that sounds, keep an eye on that and watch for that. That could be important. Now, if you see somebody tightening their jaw, seeing the muscles flex right here, as you might expect, that usually means anger. So that one is pretty easy to interpret. Now, if somebody has a very strong, or not strong, somebody has a very flat emotion, or if they have no expression and they're not somebody who is experiencing some sort of mental health crisis, because that can be a whole different thing. But if it's somebody who has no emotion at all, they're trying their best to not allow any of that emotional leakage. So if they're trying to be very neutral and very calm and very flat, oftentimes that could be a sign that somebody is trying to hide emotion. That doesn't necessarily mean they're lying, but it means they don't want you to know how they're feeling. Now, if somebody's rubbing their forehead, if you observe that action, oftentimes that can mean significant distress. So if in the context of law enforcement, if they're talking to somebody and they're starting to get nervous, they may really start doing this because that's really going to help calm them down, or it's a behavior that helps try to pacify them. When somebody runs their hand over their neck like this, it can oftentimes mean doubt, insecurity. It can be an extreme, an intense way for somebody to try to calm themselves down. We observe this mostly in males. Women tend to play with jewelry. It's the same kind of concept. Or tend to play with the spot in the bottom of your neck right here. They'll touch that spot, or play with the necklace or something like that. But that oftentimes can be a significant sign of discomfort. For men, it's not uncommon that we touch our cheeks like this, that we try to calm ourselves down. It's like a less extreme version of this. It can mean nervousness, discomfort, whatever, but if you see somebody starting to do this, that means they're trying to calm themselves down. And this is one of those behaviors that you're going to start to notice a lot if you pay attention for it. This is something that you may not off the top of your head go, yeah, I know when people do that, but you're going to start if you start paying attention to it, especially in social interactions, you're going to see people, especially people that tend to be more nervous, doing this in relation to nonverbals related to lying and deceit and things like that. That's something that if somebody starts to tell you something that's not true, they might start doing that to make themselves calm down a little bit about the lie. Now, if I was wearing a hat as a male, sometimes we do something called ventilating, which is lifting the hat off, which is sort of trying to calm down. It's like, in a sense, like letting the heat out, and for women, it tends to be more hair flipping. So if you see a woman flipping her hair, that's ventilating as well. It could mean they're bothered. They're trying to sort of calm themselves down, let all the extra heat off is really basically what they're doing. So watch for that ventilating, the hair flipping behavior. That's not always what that means, but it's associated with that oftentimes. When you see eyebrows come together, it may sound obvious, but that typically means anger. So if you're talking with somebody and their eyebrows come together, even if the rest of their face doesn't seem as extremely angry as you might think, what's important about this is when you see it quickly or when you see it subtly. Dr. Paul Ekman is someone who a lot of this information is based off of. He's the king of the research in this area. If there's anybody you want to know that is sort of the originator of a lot of this stuff, it's Dr. Paul Ekman. But he works with micro expressions, and the idea is if you very briefly see somebody doing this, or very briefly furrowing their brow, even if it's just for a quick second, that could mean that there's anger associated with what you're talking about or what they're thinking about at the time. So watching, not so much for somebody just sitting there with their eyebrows furrowed, but watching for it to happen subtly can be an indication that they're feeling some anger, that they're feeling something that they're not expressing. So if somebody's using a really intense look of thinking deeply, if they're really doing this, sometimes people that are not telling the truth are taking the time to concoct lies. It takes a lot of brain power sometimes to make something up. So if you ask somebody a fairly simple question and they're really having to think hard about it, it could be just a matter of them using a lot of brain power to try to make something up. Repeating questions is a great method for finding out more about whether or not somebody is being truthful or not. Oftentimes people don't like to lie, unless we're talking about somebody who's a sociopath, and they can lie easily though. So, that's a whole other thing. But for most people, we don't like to lie. So if you keep repeating something and you keep making somebody have to lie more, they're going to get more bothered, and the more of these emotional leakage and all this that we're going to observe. An out of sync head shake can be a sign of inauthenticity. So in other words, if you ask me a question and I said no, then that might be inauthentic. So there's a big difference between no and no, like that. There's the delay can sometimes suggest that there's something inauthentic about the response. Nodding in agreement is something that's a fascinating thing to watch. Now, what that means is that somebody is nodding and basically doing this when, in terms of law enforcement, if somebody is talking to a suspect and they're asking them if they did certain things, they may actually nod that they did. And they may not be saying it, but they may just actually be nodding. It's a really fascinating phenomenon. Sometimes when people are trying to hide things, they can unconsciously go ahead and agree with you. That's not enough to go on 100%, but watch for that, because that's something you may observe with people. There's also the opposite head shake, which is, to me, it was one of those things that I've observed a bunch of times, and it never fails to seem strange to me that sometimes people will say no and be shaking their head yes. So you ask, did you go out with this person last night? Were you out, here and there? And they go, no, I wasn't. They may actually be shaking their head yes when they mean no. It's more common than you'd think, and if you pay attention, you may notice it. And like I said, don't take anything as 100%. That doesn't mean that somebody necessarily agrees with what you're saying, but it can clue you in that it's worth exploring more. Now, if somebody's eyes look down or their head turns away, I mean, it's just an attempt to shut out somebody else. So they're doing their best to block them for whatever reason. And there's a multitude of reasons. I wouldn't say that necessarily has to do with lying or deceit. It just means they're trying to block them out. So in the context of law enforcement, if somebody asks a suspect something and they just start doing this, it's, whether it's just because they are feeling angry or feeling defensive or whatever, they're trying to block the other person out. We use our mouths throughout our lifespans, even before we're born, to calm ourselves. So oftentimes, things related to the mouth and the lips is going to be related to feeling stress or trying to feel calm. So if somebody claims to feel one emotion and doesn't show it, oftentimes that's an attempt to mislead. There's some very basic things that we can do to understand and recognize emotion in people's faces. And one of those is that all emotions, except for contempt, you can observe on both sides of the face. So when somebody smiles, if they only smile on one side, it's not a real smile. That's not real happiness. If somebody seriously smiles on one side, that they're not feeling happiness. They may say they are, but they're not feeling it. Just like sadness, if you don't see it on both sides, or anger, all of these are going to be what we call bilateral, which means both halves. The only unilateral, which means one half, the only unilateral emotion is contempt, which, is something like that. That's a really interesting and key way to spot when somebody is trying to convey an emotion and they don't really feel one. When we hear things that we don't like, we oftentimes purse our lips. Like that. If somebody's talking to a suspect and they say something that is related to something they don't want to hear, you may see them pursing their lips because they're feeling frustrated, they're feeling nervous, and oftentimes that just means they don't like what they're hearing. So when you see people with their tongue pushing the inside of their cheeks or their lips, that's a way that we calm ourselves down. Even back in when we're young infants, the reason that people suck their thumb or that we have pacifiers and things like that is that the mouth is a very soothing thing. So a lot of things related to calming down the mouth or lips is worth looking at. If you observe somebody's lips shrinking, that very literally means somebody doesn't want to say something. So, it may seem obvious, but it can be subtle at times. But if somebody keeps, doing that, there's something that they're trying to avoid saying, that they don't want to open up. Sometimes people will put their tongue between their teeth, like this. And sometimes that means that somebody thinks they just got away with something. So that's definitely a notable expression because it's sort of unusual. And a one-sided smirk. So if somebody's doing a one-sided smirk, then they're feeling contempt. Maybe they feel like they just got away with something. So keep that in mind when you see somebody smiling with one half of their mouth. So now we've covered everything from the head down to the waist. The legs and feet are going to be a different video, but there's plenty to say about them as well. I hope you come back and check out some more videos that I do on this. If there's certain subjects that you'd like for me to cover, please let me know. In the meantime, I highly recommend checking out former FBI Special Agent Joe Navarro's book, What Everybody Is Saying, and he's got several others that are fantastic. I highly recommend that. And Dr. Paul Ekman, who has created some really amazing research in this area. He's really a pioneer in the field, and if you're interested in nonverbal behaviors, if you're interested in learning more, there's an infinite amount more information there is to learn than what I have demonstrated today. So if you have any questions about this, feel free to leave a comment. If there's other videos you want me to make on psychology, let me know. And anyway, thanks for watching.